Thank you, Tony. I want to ask, are there any grandmothers in the room? Show of hands? Fantastic. Wow. Well, you're a very special breed. And I know because I'm married to one. And I don't know what it's about them, but their amount of love and encouragement to their grandchildren is just right off the clock. And it reminds me of the silly story, and you may have heard this, of this woman. She gets on a train and she's looking for a window seat, and unfortunately all the window seats are taken. But there's a few aisle seats, and as she walks back with her handbag, she sees a lady reading a magazine by the window, and she says, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you a grandmother?" And the woman looks up and she goes, "Well, yes, I am." The woman ignores her and she carries on, and she sees another empty seat and she goes, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am, are you a grandmother?" And the woman, again, she looks up and she goes, "Well, yes, I am." This time the woman who's walking is getting very frustrated, and she keeps asking this question until she thinks she has to go to the next train car. Finally, the last seat, she asks the woman, "Are you a grandmother?" And the woman says, "No, I'm not." She goes, "Great." She sits down, she opens up her bag, she pulls out some albums, says, "Here's some pictures of my grandchildren." Have you ever sat with someone like that? I share this story with you because we're going to get a little bit emotional today. We're going to talk about grandchildren. We're going to talk about somebody's grandchild, somebody's child. And the story actually goes back to 100 years ago, where there was a farm boy, and his name was Charles Hickey. And he was somebody's child, somebody's brother. And he was born in Nanaimo and raised in Parksville. And he joined the First World War with his father. And they joined the Canadian Mounted Rifles. And when he got overseas, his eyes turned skyward and he became a pilot. And he actually did very well over there. And at the very young age of 21, he'd actually hit 21 victories, 21 kills against the enemy. And sadly, just within weeks before, he was killed in a mid-air collision with a friendly. And of course, that was devastating to his family. It was devastating to his friends and neighbors, and it lasted a long time. In fact, I got to meet his niece in Calgary on this tour, and she showed me his logbook and some of the pictures and some of the stories, so we were very fortunate. Closer to home, there was a boy that was from the Comox Valley here, and he was somebody's grandson, he was somebody's son, he was somebody's neighbor, and he was my neighbor. And many of you may know who I'm talking about. It's Andrew Eichenboom, famous Boomer's Legacy. Now, Andrew was the first medic killed in action since the Korean War back in 2006 in Afghanistan. He used to write his mom, Maureen, who's right here in the valley and good friends of ours, and say, you know, the kids over in Afghanistan have been treated so poorly and they don't have the opportunities we have here in Canada. If only we could just have even a bit of what we have in Canada over there, it would make such a difference. So she wanted his name to mean something, and she started up Boomer's Legacy, which was a wonderful, wonderful project, and it's still going today. And actually what they do is they raise money so that soldiers can decide to help others who are in need in different war-torn countries. Now, I share these two stories of these two gentlemen with you because I've actually put them on the side of my airplane. What happens is each of us wanted to recognize a hero on the side of our aircraft, so we put the names of these two people because they were local in our area. And that was really important to us as we go through. Now, the role that I want to share with you today, and it's basically the mission of what Vimy Flight was all about, was to commemorate, to educate, and to celebrate. And we're celebrating Canada's 150 that just passed, as well as the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy. Now, you may ask, why would we want to celebrate the Battle of Vimy Ridge? And I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. But basically, what it started is, it was the very first time that Canadians got to fight together as 4 Canadian divisions, not all mixed up with the British Commonwealth, but actually alone. And they actually had a triumphant victory that was not being able to be accomplished by either the French or the British in the First World War. First of all, has anyone had the chance to visit Vimy? Several of you. Great. I really recommend it. I know this Probus group is all about adventure and travel. You really should put it on your bucket list. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll see why. Because it's a remarkable facility. It's located just about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Paris. It's a large Canadian park. It was given to Canada in perpetuity because of the great sacrifice that our Canadians did there over 100 years ago. So what was that battle about? Basically, it was a ridge, and it was a very strategically attractive ridge that the Germans held for many years. In fact, in the first years of the war, the French lost over 170,000 troops trying to take the ridge, and they couldn't do it. And a year later, the British tried with the exact same number. So it was over 250,000 troops lost their lives trying to take that ridge from the Germans, and they weren't able to do it. And yet, in April of 1917, just 100 years ago, 25,000 Canadians with 3 months of preparation took the ridge in 3 days with only 5% of the losses. It was absolutely remarkable. And of course, it was amazing for many aspects, and we're going to go through that, but a lot of it was to do with technology, and a lot of it was to do with the fact that they were all volunteers at the time. They weren't conscripts like the Germans at the time. The Germans were very tired and fatigued, and they were all drafted, and so they were not in a very happy place to be there. But we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in that war, and of course some of the advances that took place was a strategy called the creeping barrage, where they'd take artillery and they'd fire it over the heads of the friendly troops in a timed event, and they'd practice this so they could advance in time to make their forward path. They also took great use of the tunnels, but so did the Germans. And the tunnels over there are built of chalk. Seeing the White Cliffs of Dover, that very same chalk goes under the English Channel and into Northern Europe. And it is actually an incredible area to show that actually there's catacombs and tunnels all throughout northern France that were there back in medieval periods, where anyone who was persecuted could hide away. And that's actually where our troops were hiding and training, and then they would tunnel forward to put armor and munitions underneath enemy artillery positions, or they would just tunnel up to the forward trenches where they would actually go and fight. And when they finally ended up fighting, those of you in the back of the room are looking at me, that's how far we were away from the enemy when we came up on that day. So it was a very ugly and very dangerous battle, but they were able to take their wounded back through those tunnels. But really, what we want to talk about today was how the aviation and how the airplane had such a significant role, not only in Vimy Ridge, but also in the First World War. You see, when those airplanes were developed, it was just literally a dozen years after the Wright brothers flew. So the first generals that saw them, they didn't know what to do with them. So they said, well, why don't you put them up in the sky like our balloons for observation? In fact, they were called scouts. The first pilots were from the cavalry, and they actually tried to fly with their spurs on. So you can imagine with a fabric airplane how well that would do. Now there is something else that is significant though about the cavalry flying those airplanes, and that is, how many of you have had an opportunity to ride a horse? So then you know which side of a horse you mount. From what side do you approach a horse? The left side, exactly. So on these little airplanes, they had a stirrup on the side of the fuselage that you put your foot in to strap into the airplane. It was very good because that way they knew when they were scrambled en masse, they would run out to the proper side of the airplane, and the ground crew that was supporting and strapping them in would go to the same side. Isn't it fascinating? The next time you get on WestJet or Air Canada, what side of the airplane do you get on? So these sort of traditions can actually carry forward over time. But really, what happened is in this observation where they would give them back artillery positions, or they would go fly deeper and they'd find maybe lines of communication like railways or ammo dumps or barracks, they could report that back, but they couldn't remember everything, and communication to the ground wasn't good, so they started carrying cameras, and that's when the advent of aerial photography took place. And aerial reconnaissance was a huge part of the First World War, especially on the Western Front. And it actually blossomed this massive technology, and just like all cruel things that happen in battle, there are also some wonderful offsets of technology. And this technology actually carried forward to Canada because... So the Battle of Vimy was won. However, it was at great cost, and we wanted to honor our people that were lost. And so the War Graves Commission of the Commonwealth, as well as Canada, put out, and they put out a submission to an architect who won it in the 20s, named Alward, who took 15 years to build this beautiful memorial. And the memorial is absolutely spectacular, not only in its size, but in its presentation. The statues that are inside, whether it's for peace and hope and Mother Canada crying. But what's more significant is the names that are engraved on the side. Because you can imagine how painful it would have been to have lost. There were 25,000 Canadians that lost their lives overseas. But many of them did not have graves because they were never found. So how painful would that be for your family to go over to try and visit a gravesite and find they weren't there? As a result, this memorial has over 11,000 names of lost Canadian soldiers that are there in perpetuity and are to be honored every time they go over. And when it was finally presented in 1936, which is, just less than 20 years after the war, there were many families that really wanted to go over to see this memorial, and they had this massive ceremony. And it literally took many people a long way to get over there in very tough times. Back in 1936, I was doing this presentation in Windsor, Ontario, and a woman came up to us, and her name was Lois Brown. And she said, I've been to Vimy twice. And I said, well, that's amazing. She goes, I said, were you there this year? And she goes, yes, I was. And I was there the first time. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. 1936, she says, yes. She says, I was 8 years old. I went with my 4-year-old sister. My dad thought it was so important. We were all about put up on a ship. It took several weeks to get across so that we could be there for this memorial opening. This picture is the why for us. And when you have a big project and you sometimes hit roadblocks and you think, well, maybe this isn't going to work for us, this was what we kept coming back to. And the person who had this vision was our team lead, and his name is Allan Snowie. Now, Allan and I flew together in the airlines, but he was originally a Royal Canadian Navy pilot, and he never lets me forget. He's part of these Navy training. He flew off the Bonaventure. He's a great historian, and he wrote books on the Bonnie and on the Second World War. And he built one of these little biplanes, and he flew it across Canada for the 100th anniversary of flight about 9 years ago. And when he did that, he finished, and his wife followed below with a car and supporting him. And she thought he was absolutely bonkers to do this. And literally, he barely finished it. And he said, something? 100th anniversary of Vimy's coming up. I want to put together a team, and I want to reenact this on April 9th of 2017. So clearly, she thought he was insane. But he started to get some friends who thought he was insane, who called some other friends who thought he was still insane. And I got a call about 2 years ago. And after 30 minutes, I realized that this mission was really important and I wanted to be a part of it. So we're going to talk about how that happened. So we have some of these airplanes gathered and we have some pilots. And what he wanted was all military pilots, mostly because we knew how to fly in formation, but even more importantly, that we had worked on a squadron together. And those of you who have that opportunity, you realize that you think the same, it's culturally the same, and you understand each other's position, because we knew we were going to go through a lot of challenges and hardships as we went along the way. We were targeting to have 6 airplanes ready to go, everyone trained, and have 10 pilots, because some of them were still working with the airlines. I'm retired, but some of them weren't, and so we needed spare pilots to do the cross-Canada journey after Vimy that took place this summer in 2017. So we were almost had enough airplanes. In fact, when I was invited, I didn't need an airplane. They said, no, you're just going to be a spare pilot. It would be terrific if you can come along and help us out. Maybe you'd be the flight safety officer or something. And then they were one short because the last airplane they were going to buy was in rough shape. And so I got a team together and we started looking at building a kit like we were going to get the ones out of Langley being built as Sopwith Pups when an airplane came up out of Nanaimo. And the builder was a cabinet maker. He spent 10 years building. He never flew it. And I picked it up for a song. It was 90% done, but it needed 90% to go. So we brought it back. And originally, the design was built by a gentleman out of Alberta who is an ultralight pilot. And it was really a book of ideas. It wasn't really a book of plans. And to give you an idea, the wing was a page and a half instruction, but this wooden gun had 7 pages of instructions on how to build it. Now, this wooden gun is actually a mock-up of the Lewis machine gun. It's a 303, 48 rounds, and it was mounted just like that up top. Later, they had a rack that could bring it down so that the pilot could change that magazine, that round cover on the top, but initially he didn't. Now, these airplanes are really challenging to fly. You need to have your feet on the rudder pedals all the time, and you need to keep your hands on the controls. Obviously, there's no autopilot, and it's not a stable airplane. So if you're in a dogfight and you run out of bullets, and a machine gun with 48 rounds will run out of bullets quickly, you had to leave the fight. You had to stand up and steer with your knees. Then you had to try and undo the magazine, and you couldn't throw it away because it belonged to the King of England. It would come out of your paycheck, and you'd have to put it down, and you put in a new one, and you'd lock it in and try and return to the fight. These guys had a lot of challenges, and one of the other challenges they had was this engine. This was the original engine that went in the First World War little Nieuport 11, and it's called a Gnome Rotary, not a radial, but a rotary engine. So it looks like some of these engines you've seen on airplanes before, but what's significant here is that all that you see here spins. This is bolted to the airframe. Everything else spins and is connected to the propeller. It's a bizarre design, and it comes with its own set of problems. One of them is a huge gyroscopic effect. Have anyone had the chance to hold a gyroscope in your hand? So if you hold a gyroscope in your hand, it's really stable and it's spinning. But if you try and twist it, it actually will move in your hand 90 degrees. It's called gyroscopic precession. And of course, something with a huge flywheel effect like this on a 700-pound airplane, if the pilot was in a dive and he pulls out of the dive, it doesn't matter what he does with the control stick or the rudder pedals, the airplane would go into a hard left turn, which made him pretty predictable to the enemy at the time. He had another problem with this engine. It had no carburetor per se and no throttle control. So how does he control his speed when he wants to come in and land? Any ideas? He literally has a button in the cockpit, an electrical button that grounds the spark plugs and kills the ignition, stops the engine. Now, if you stop that with your car, the engine would stop, but this thing has a flywheel, as I mentioned, so it keeps fluttering and it goes winds like a windmill. And the friendly troops could hear him coming home because he would push the button often to slow down, and it would go foo, 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 and then he'd release wham, ba, 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 foo, 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 wham, ba, 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 ba. When he took off, clearly he wouldn't want to push the button, so he would keep full power and it would climb away. It didn't climb fast, about 60 miles an hour, but it could climb very well. And in fact, it was reported some of these airplanes went over 20,000 feet. Now, as you know, you need oxygen normally above 10,000 feet by law. So these guys were flying without heat, without oxygen, and especially during the Hungarian-Austrian gap, some of them got to those sort of altitudes. So they had a heck of a lot of challenges, and clearly we didn't want those. And I don't want to whine too much about our problems because, you know, the 10 pilots, we have a combined total flying experience of over 230,000 flying hours. And the pilots in the First World War, some of them were actually going into combat with 7 to 8 hours. And some of them had never seen an airplane before until they started their ground school. So it's truly remarkable. Ironically, we wanted a little more modern engine, and here's the real irony. That's a Volkswagen derivative, a German-designed engine, but it's got different cylinder heads, different ignition system, and it's designed for aviation. This little clip here gives you an idea. It's just flying over the Comox estuary. And what you're looking at here is the flying wires going up that support the upper wing, and these landing wires are curved back because they're slightly slack. And of course, as you can imagine, they support the wing structure when you land. If you listen carefully, you might be able to hear the sound of the wind in the wing, in the wires. It's a great joy to fly. It's like strapping on a motorcycle. And because you get the bugs in the eye, face, and you get the wind in your hair, that sort of thing. But it's a little bit like a dandelion seed in the sky because it's so light. So if there's any turbulence or winds, it gets floated and moved around quite aggressively. It's also really tricky to land on a hard surface. You see, in the First World War, they didn't have runways. They only had fields, square fields. So they never had to take off with a crosswind. And they didn't have a tail wheel. They had a skid, a wooden tiller out the back. So as soon as the tail came down, that skid took in, it dug, it supported the airplane, and it helped bring it to a stop, but it kept it straight. Unfortunately, we couldn't use a wooden skid on our hard runway, so we put a tail wheel on and it becomes sort of like Bambi on ice. Now we need differential braking, we need tail wheel steering, and of course if there's a crosswind, we don't get to land across the runway unless it's a very wide runway and a very strong wind. But we needed to train our guys, and we all had different amounts of flying experience on these little type of airplanes, and we all got upgraded, and we needed a place to train, and fortunately, through great negotiations, and it took a long time, we got permission to train out here at 19 Wing Comox. And they were super supportive of us, and it really helped us get going. We had terrific weather in the summer of 2016, and we had some wonderful photography done. This was put on Canadian Aviator magazine, again, to try and promote the cause. And we needed to promote this cause because, you know, you just can't put a team together and then go and fly over in France, you actually have to prove that you're worthy. You have to, Veteran Affairs was organizing this thing, and they had many requests. There were people who were Jeep collectors. There was a gentleman who had a Lee Enfield rifle his grandfather had, and he wanted to stand and shoot with a 21 gun salute. You know, they got turned down from a lot of sort of crazy ideas. And so we had to produce evidence that we were legitimate and that we were ready to go. The base photographer took a picture of this, and I guess I'm one of the few guys that is fortunate enough to fly both of these airplanes. People ask, what's the difference? They're Canada's first fighter, Canada's latest fighter. Both swept wing, both highly maneuverable, both have a gun. Both are dynamically unstable. So what does that mean? If you have a tricycle, a kid's tricycle, that's pretty stable. You get a bicycle, that's less stable. If you get on a unicycle, that's really unstable, but obviously very maneuverable. So an airliner is a stable platform. It's designed to be keeping passengers comfortable, looking out for smooth operations, whereas a fighter is very dynamic. It has to be quickly maneuverable. And both these aircraft are like that. They're very sensitive on the flight controls, and they both maneuver quite well. So really remarkable when you consider where the technology has gone. People ask how we got over to France, and I often joke that we ran out of volunteers to fly them over the ocean because it only had 200-mile range and 60 miles an hour. We started running out of folks that would really want to sign up for that. And we were looking at maybe a container, but clearly this was the eye on the prize. And it's a C-117 Globemaster. Canada has 4 of them. There's only 4 nations in the world that actually fly these aircraft, and they're really remarkable. And the question was, do you think we could fit 7 airplanes inside them? We didn't even take the wings off, the little guys. The first 4 airplanes of the Nieuports, the Sopwith Pups, are at the back. They were completed by the Canadian Museum of Flight over in Langley, and unfortunately, even though one of them flew a little bit, it was so far behind in its progress that we had to promise the Air Force that it would only go over as a static display, which was really important, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes when we get over there. And then the Nieuport, the SE-5 is coming up the center at the back for the 7 airplanes, and the wings are underneath the fuselage for those other airplanes. Could you imagine if you were a World War I pilot and you actually came on board something like this? You'd swear it was a spaceship, wouldn't you? Well, it was a very exciting day as we got ready to load the airplane and get over to France. They threw me in the left seat of the airplane when we were going over the Atlantic for a few minutes. And we're on approach here now into Lille, which is in northern France. So just to give you an idea of the geography here, we had to land at a large international airport like Comox, and then we needed to fly to a much smaller grass strip, about the distance from here to Qualicum Beach, and then we were operating out of this little grass strip called Lens Bonnefontaine, which is only 6 miles north of Vimy, and that's our operation. Now when we landed, it was very bad weather there, but we were greeted with amazing welcoming committee, and our lives literally, quite literally, changed forever. And it was a result of many of those people in those orange suits. They were absolutely remarkable. We had many challenges in Canada to try and get over there, but when we got to France, the only response we got from them was no problem. Any question came up, it was always no problem. And I want to give you a quick example of that. As I mentioned, the weather was just rancid when we got there. Wind and snow and wind and rain, just like World War I was actually 100 years ago. And we needed a hangar space to store the airplanes when the big Globemaster landed. Well, they found us hangar space, which you can imagine is usually at a really high premium at a large international airport. Well, when the airplane landed in its normal spot, we couldn't actually even taxi over to that hangar area because it was over a mile away down taxiways and runways. We would have flipped over in the wind. No problem. They brought in huge trucks with great cost because we were 24 hours late. It was now a weekend. They had to pay overtime drivers. They had to pay special taxes on their roads. And they brought in these flatbed trucks. And we rolled off an airplane one at a time and strapped them down. We're all hanging on to the little control surfaces so they won't flap in the wind. And we had police escort as we taxied down a big runway and over a taxiway. And we get to the hangar and there's no way to get them off the truck. No problem. They found a bunch of pallets and they made a Lego type ramp and we got them off and we got them secured. Well, anyway, as we got on, we finally got some decent weather and we started to fly over to Lens Bonnefontaine, and this is where our debrief area is, a beautiful place called the Hurricane Bar and Grill for our more informal get-togethers. And they also were hosting us at a great rate. They couldn't do enough for us. And one restaurant owner shut down his restaurant, decorated it up, had live music, and really treated and hosted us well. Now, we're Canadians, we're pretty used to hospitality and being hospitable to people who come to our town. But this was over and above. We didn't understand. It was way, way over the top in terms of what they were trying to do for us. And we couldn't figure this out until we saw this. And this. And this. This last picture is from Notre Dame de Lorette. It's 8 miles northwest of Vimy. It's a French grave site from the First World War. French soldiers were buried there in the number of 66,000. And they're scattered throughout that whole North Country, in Belgium and Holland and everywhere else. And to give you an idea of why they understand this so much better than we do as Canadians, I want you to imagine for a moment, if you can just go back 100 years, that you owned a little bakery in a little village. Maybe your father and grandfather owned it and it's passed on to you. And you're running your bakery and you go to your church and you have your social clubs. And then all of a sudden, your hometown, your bakery, doesn't belong to you anymore. It's been invaded by a foreign country with a foreign language. And suddenly you rebel and you start to fight. And somebody dies in your family and you get to bury them. And you fight more and you get to bury them. And you keep burying, and all of a sudden your normal life has just turned into a living hell. You're starving, you're a refugee in your own country, you don't have this bakery anymore. They teach their children this because they live it, it's their grandparents. And when you go there, you'll go to villages around Vimy that fly more Canadian flags than we fly in Canada on Canada Day. Because they couldn't figure out why a kid from New Zealand or Australia or Canada would come over and risk their lives so that they could get their bakery back. It was unbelievable. And we wanted to share that with other people. We wanted to share it with young Canadians, and we're very fortunate because what happened was EF Educational Tours is a massive tour company that takes young Canadians over. And for the 95th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy, they took 4,000 Air Cadet students and teachers, and this year they took 9,000 from all over Canada, over 200 schools, teachers, students, cadets, and their officers. And they set them to a huge display. And we were able to put on that display exhibit hall this wonderful Sopwith Pup that was built so well in Langley. Here you can see all these students, and some of them you may even see around the valley wearing these jackets because there are about 1.5 dozen that came from the valley here that got to go over there as well. And each one of them, when asked, they said the same thing: I only wish my fellow schoolmates could have come here and seen what we saw. It was that significant. So back at the field, back at our training field, there was really wonderful folks that were terrific with the camera, and they wanted to help out, and they wanted to take some of these terrific photographs. This pyramid back is actually a coal slag pile, and it's over 100 years old. And again, it just shows you that was the resource that the Germans wanted to have at that time. Coal was very valuable in that northern region. But it's just an old slag pile, and this is their grass strip with our old airplanes flying. And again, they took some terrific pictures, some pretty good times out there. Some silly hero shot. And we trained, and the weather really got great. As I mentioned, 100 years ago, it was a snowstorm, and we really realized how important it was that we had to pray a lot to make sure that we got good weather on the flyover day if we were going to try and reenact. And so we started our flying mission. And when we flew over this airspace, it was really emotional for the pilots because we realized this was where the very first fighter aviators started. Billy Bishop and others were right in that airspace. And when we're flying over the landmarks of all these grave sites, and you realize that the tremendous sacrifice and bloodshed and horror that went over in that area, that we were actually trying to honor those people that had lost so much. And we really were overwhelmed by where we were and what we were flying. In fact, our lead told us to take the airplanes one at a time over the site so that we could mist up our goggles one at a time and not realize that we're not in close formation at the time. So when we did go as a two-ship like this, we spread out when we went to look at the memorial. One of our holding points was this beautiful little village of St. Eloi. You can see the poor bombed out cathedral off to the right. There's a circle at the bottom here. And it's about 30 feet, 10 meters across. Any idea what that is? I learned this from my colleagues who are really good historians. That's called a cornflower, and it's a peace symbol in France. And often you'll see the cornflower and the poppy together over in France. So on the given day, we were able to try to achieve this, and the weather was looking really good. Everyone was in position, and we managed to pull it off, which was pretty exciting. So you can see our airplanes are a lot smaller, and that is because the ones in the first picture above were larger airplanes, but also the laws had changed. They were allowed to overfly a crowd. We had to stay 500 feet laterally. And so what we did is we tried to position as close as we could to the original flight, and then we did a right-hand 270-degree turn overhead. And I've got some interesting photographs for you here now that you might enjoy. So we used a 3-plane plus a 2-plane. But you can see the shadow of our airplanes here on this modeled grass. Why is it modeled? Yeah, exactly. Those are bombs and artillery shells, and it's nice and green now, but it was ugly black and full of blood and horror barbed wire fields. And even today, there are live munitions that are potentially buried there. So it is cordoned off from the public. It's got an electric fence there. No one's allowed to go in except sheep. I think they got a real bad deal there. I don't know. Terrible visions on that. Anyway, I'm going to try and run this little video here. And let's turn the volume down. So here we are approaching from the west. We had a slight tailwind that day. We had to wait for the royal family to sit down. You can see all the people up here on the upper part, and then all the people down below, about 25,000 people. And I was very privileged to lead the formation. I was asked to lead because of my background in fighter aviation compared to the other guys. Some of them had fighter experience, but not to the extent that I had, and that was just very good luck on my part. Anyway, to lead the formation, it was a challenge because now we're over the low ground that was held by the Germans, and we're going to circle back, and we're going to come back over those tall trees to the right. Now that's a climbing hill there, so we had to try and add some power to turn, and the wind was coming down that hill, which was actually pushing down on the little planes. These airplanes don't have an excess amount of power, and I couldn't use full power because if I did, the person on the outside of the turn would fall back. If I used too little power, the person on the inside of the circle would fall out of the sky. So it was a little bit of a trick to try and make sure everybody was happy on that. And so we kept them safe. And now we're coming around the backside. Now we're going to come over this modeled area again, but I want you to notice the defensive German trenches, because they were defensive trenches and they were different shape, and they're still there. You can't see them from the ground, but you can certainly see them from the air. Look how they're square. So if you're on the ground, you wouldn't notice that, but that was one of the remarkable things that we got to observe. So people ask me, what was it like? You know, was it emotional? And of course it was emotional. What was it like? And so I tried to use this analogy. Maybe you've done this terrible cruel trick to your dog, but have you ever put a cookie on the nose of your dog and asked it not to eat the treat? And it sits there still? Well, how does the dog handle that? Basically, it stays very still, and it looks not at the cookie, it looks through it. It tries to ignore the cookie. And for me, that's what I did with the memorial. Because in a military formation, how we do it is we brief the mission. And we go through all the details, and then we actually fly the mission, and when we come back, we debrief the mission. So I knew that there were a lot of things at stake to make sure that this went well. So we briefed it and we flew it, and like I said, I was trying to ignore, just fly the mission. But when I landed and I shut down, instead of going to debrief, we all ran towards each other and started hugging. And then my knees started to shake and tears started to flow. And I was a ball of mess because I was crying. I was looking around, everybody's crying because we pulled it off. And we realized that this was so important to do this for this day. And it was a real privilege to have had that honor. And then we posed up for this silly photograph that someone's photoshopped, and I said, it makes old pilots look older. I'd like to introduce the 5 guys that were fortunate enough to fly. The other 5 that were there were just as worthy. They got to fly the day before on other missions and also the day after at Beaumont Hamel. And that's a whole other presentation. But for now, the first gentleman on the left is Brent Handy, and he's our active Air Force pilot. We had an ulterior motive of asking the general in the Air Force if we could bring on a military pilot that was active, because we thought if they put one of their boys in the game, maybe we'll get that beautiful C-17 to take us overseas. We wanted someone who had formation experience, of course, but also tailwheel time if possible. Brent Handy is an ex-F-18 pilot. He flew with the Snowbirds. His present job is the standards officer for the Snowbirds. Looks after all the standardization and training for the Snowbird pilots. He owns his own Pitts Special, which is a biplane air show aircraft, and he does air shows around the country. So he was a remarkable individual and a great teammate to have. Next to him is Peter Thornton. Peter is an immigrant from the RAF. We tease him about his fake British accent. He flew Jaguars and Tornadoes over in Europe, and he immigrated to Canada with his family and flew the Challenger and the T-33 out on the East Coast, and now he's a captain with Air Canada. And he was one of the founding members. He's our ops officer. I'm the guy in the middle and the lead. Allan Snowie is our team lead, and I really want to make that distinction. Allan, actually, he's the guy who had the insight, and he was the guy who had the vision to keep us all on the right track on this whole mission going across. And it was a real privilege. And he flew in the number 5 position on the SE-5. And Larry Ricker, who's from Moncton, New Brunswick, he got his wings off of the Air Cadet program, and he flew all sorts of different aircraft, and he's a 777 captain today. And across Canada, he would actually fly from Moncton to Charlottetown, and then into Quebec City, and then he'd be gone. He'd taken 500, 400 people over to Frankfurt, come back and fly at 60 miles an hour again into Ottawa in Southern Ontario. He's gone again over to Hong Kong. And and today he's doing a presentation in St. John's, Newfoundland, just like you're hearing here today. So he's a terrific guy, and he was the number 3 position on the outside. So we had a remarkable experience in France, and it was time to say farewell, and we had to bring the airplanes home, and we wanted to bring them to St. John's, Newfoundland, but it was too costly. So we brought them into Greenwood, Nova Scotia, and we started in Halifax, and we unloaded them, and we started flying to Halifax and all through Nova Scotia, Summerside and Charlottetown, and throughout southern Quebec and into Ottawa for Canada Day. Larry led the team 3-plane over Ottawa. And then through southern Ontario, we shipped them to Winnipeg, and then flew them from Winnipeg out to Calgary, shipped them over to the island here, and they finished up in Victoria. We got this lovely little trailer off of Craigslist in the Maritimes, and we had it nicely wrapped as their support. I wanted to encourage you to go to our website. It's still up and running. If you wanted to buy hats, used to have a whole bunch of hats and things here. We've pretty much done that now. Bring you back to the story about Charles Hickey and Andrew Eichenboom, because we are so blessed to live in this country, to have a place where our little bakery isn't going to get taken away from us, that our homes are safe. And it's because of people that are willing to protect us, whether it's the firefighters or the police people or any other people who are willing to put themselves in harm's way so that we can have the lives we enjoy. And that's what we're here to honor. Thank you. Did you want to take questions? Or? Yes. Yeah, okay. So if anyone has any questions, I kind of rattled through a lot. Yes?
There are a lot of former Air Force pilots that transition into commercial airlines like Air Canada.
Yeah, very many, like myself, yes, yes.
What's it like to transition from basically military life to civilian life?
It takes an adjustment, and in terms of going from fighter aviation to heavy transport, I often remark that it's sort of like going from a hockey team to a football team. You're a team player, it's a team sport. Just because you're a good hockey player don't mean you're going to be a very good football player, so you have to learn all over. And that's a really good question, because it actually applied to when we were checking out the pilots on this little airplane is that you may have had a tremendous amount of experience flying a 777, but this isn't a 777. So you really need to throw away any preconceived ideas and start fresh. So as a young new airline pilot, then that would be one of the recommendations, yes. Yes, sir.
What has happened with the aircraft now?
What happened with the aircraft? Well, I got to tell you fairly frankly, we had a lot of issues going across Canada, maintenance issues and some crashes. No one was killed or no one was injured. Small, little minor scratches and scrapes. But we really damaged, the airplanes were not designed to do this cross-Canada journey. It was very difficult on it. And so we ended up with 3 airplanes finally coming to the West Coast. One was shipped all the way back. It's in St. John's, Newfoundland at the rooms right now. It belongs to Larry. It's going to go back to Moncton. Mine is here in Courtney Air Park. It stopped flying actually in southern Ontario. It had an incident that allowed it to be a static display. It worked out quite well because in Winnipeg we'd take it to the museum, have it set up. The flying airplanes would come over every day, and then people would come back in the museum and then they could see the airplane and strap their kids in and that sort of thing. I got it flying a couple of months ago when it did finally return here, and it's back in good running order again. But it really did need a lot of care and feeding. And the 3rd aircraft was very old and tired already, and it was donated to the RCAF in Ottawa, and it was shipped back from Victoria. Yeah.
How does a pilot pick up the skills to be a mechanic?
How does a pilot pick up the skills to be a mechanic? Well, you don't always. I was very fortunate. I started off as a mechanic as a kid. My dad was a maintenance engineering officer, and I was in the Air Force Reserve as a technician for 2 years before I joined the regular force. And I built an ultralight. So there are builders and there's flyers and there's a few that are fortunate enough to do both. But we were really fortunate on our journey. We really needed a really good mechanic. And Darwin Zuba from the Valley here, he's a machinist millwright who helped build my airplane before, joined our team. And he came over to France with us. And then in Eastern Ontario, or Eastern Canada in Nova Scotia, Dan Daigle, who was a technician, and I hadn't seen him in 40 years, made contact with him through Facebook. And he joined our team for the Cross Canada, and he helped with maintenance as well. So it was very helpful. Yeah. Yes?
I recall there being a question of First World War fighter aircraft having issues with the machine gun, coordinating, missing their prop when as they're flying through.
Absolutely.
This aircraft had that?
Yeah, no, and that's why the engine, this picture shows that the gun is not mounted, but the gun had to be mounted above the propeller arc initially because they didn't have a way of synchronizing. The synchronization was designed by a Dutchman named Fokker, you know, the old Fokker thing, and then they applied it to all the aircraft. Initially what they tried to do is actually put metal deflectors, can you imagine? So there were ricochets coming back at the pilots. That didn't go over very well. But finally they did find a synchronized station to put it through. But even with the gun above, it didn't really matter that much because as long as you sight it on the ground, you know, they still had a sighting system for the pilot who was shooting below. Because later, you know, guns were put on wings. They were put all different areas on the aircraft. I can share with you kind of a funny story that's a true story about a pilot of the Royal Flying Corps named Lieutenant Strange. You got time to listen to this crazy story? Look it up on the internet because you're not going to believe it. So Lieutenant Strange, young pilot, he goes out into battle in the First World War, northern France. Actually, he's over enemy lines. He gets up to 8,800 feet. He starts descending down to enter the combat arena with all the other pilots. And as he's so high and it's so cold, he goes to shoot, his gun jams, which happens a lot because the oil they use would congeal in that cold temperature. The only way to unjam the gun is to take the magazine off. So he literally left the fight, stood up, steered with his knees, tried to undo the magazine. It was jammed. He's jerking and really coaxing that magazine when suddenly the airplane slips out of his reach of his knees, flips upside down, and he falls out. He grabs anything he can, and what's he holding on to? The very magazine that he was hoping would come off a second before. The airplane is in an inverted spin, which means it's going down uncontrollably, and he's looking at this little German village come into view and go out of view and into view and out of view as he's coming through the dogfight. And he gets quiet because the dogfighting stops because everybody's looking at this guy. He tries desperately to get back into the cockpit, and it's not working. And he keeps kicking and kicking and flancing around. Through some miracle, the aircraft rights itself and goes into a spiral dive. He falls back into the cockpit, but head first. His feet are now up in the air and his head's down by the rudder pedals. He broke the seat on the way in because it was made of a series of wood and wicker. So he's trying to force himself back out of the cockpit as the airplane's plummeting towards the earth, throwing pieces of wood out, and then he finally rights himself and pulls out of the dive and returns to land. I think only his laundryman knew how scared he was. He didn't tell anyone, but the Germans, they claimed to kill. So there was an investigation, and when his supervisor found out, he scolded him for damaging the aircraft. Lieutenant Strange went on to live a very good life. He fought again in the Second World War and lived a ripe old age. So remarkable. Look it up. I want to thank you for your time today. It's been a wonderful time to spend with you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Absolutely super.